Hello, gamers, and thank you for tuning into another episode of the Cartridge Club. The Cartridge Club is a community of gamers, collectors, content creators, and gaming enthusiasts of all generations. The show that you're listening to is effectively a monthly book club, but for gamers. We pick a game, invite everyone in the club to play along, and select a couple of community members to come on the show to discuss the game. My name is Ryan, and I'm one of the hosts for the show. Without any further ado, let me introduce the panel for this month. From the blog Caught Me Gaming, we have Sarah.
Hello.
And from the YouTube channel Burning Books and the podcast Masters of Unlocking, we have Caleb.
Hi, What Remains of Edith Finch is one of the best games ever.
Thanks for being here.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for having me.
And now I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, MustyHobbit, and he'll let us know which game we're playing for this month. Musty?
Thank you, Ryan, and welcome everyone to March's Cartridge Club Prime episode. You've already seen the title. You've already heard Caleb announced. You should know that March is quite appropriate for a walking simulator. And so we are playing What Remains of Edith Finch. And we're very excited to have our panel along with us today and our patrons here to take in the discussion live. While we won't necessarily be discussing every element of every story thread in this game, I should warn you now that we won't be holding back on what you would term spoilers. This game itself takes roughly 2 hours to complete. It's readily available on a number of platforms, including just recently added to Xbox Game Pass. So if you have any desire to play the game for yourself, this would be your last opportunity. I won't blame you if you need to pause us to give it a quick playthrough.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for those who are ready to find out all the secrets this crazy house has to share, let's hit the breakdown. The critically acclaimed What Remains of Edith Finch is a first-person narrative exploration game released in 2017 by developer Giant Sparrow Games. You take the role of Edith Finch, the last of the Finch family tree, who has returned to her family home in the forests of Washington state to learn more about her family and the perceived curse that has caused all but one member of each generation to die in unusual ways. Edith traverses the house, coming across closed-off bedrooms, serving as shrines to her deceased family members, and discovering the stories behind their demise. A total of 12 individual stories play out as vignettes with varying gameplay elements and styles. At the 2017 Game Awards, What Remains of Edith Finch took home the trophy for Best Narrative, even when put up against titles such as Horizon Zero Dawn, Wolfenstein 2, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, and Nier Automata. The 2018 BAFTA Games crowned Edith Finch as Best Game over Horizon, Hellblade, Super Mario Odyssey, and The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. So with that kind of reputation, let's hear our panel's overall impressions before we spend the rest of our time today walking through the Finch House.
Well, if you want to know my overall impression of What Remains of Edith Finch, I'd have to say that I loved it. I loved it. Lately, I've been into walking simulators, and this was right up my alley. Right from the beginning, it had everything that I could ever possibly want, right down to when Edith approaches that yellow gate. No trespassing. I'm like, what? I think I'm going to be exploring something very special here. And I'm into the urban exploration thing. I don't do it myself. I let other people do that. But this game actually lets you go on property and trespass and check things out. And just going on that path and cresting the hill, and you see the Finch family house. And then you approach the house itself, and you notice it's a home, but it's not a home. It's more than that, and it's got add-on after add-on, and then you crawl into the house, and you're able to go in room by room, and looking at all of the objects in this house, it was like the people evaporated from the home, and from there, it's like your mind just goes down a rabbit hole, and you wonder what happened to these people and what's going on, and immediately you learn that Milton is missing, and I thought for sure that it had to do with that, but it's not. And so many questions, and it just made you want to keep going and going and going and going through that house and finding out more and what Edith's history was. And I just adored it. I really did. I was vested into this game in a big way, and I'd closely give it a 5.
Out of 5, yeah.
Yeah, for how it made me feel. It had all the elements, great music, the story was quirky. I like that. It really emoted feelings in me. I really enjoyed it.
Excellent. Caleb, what about you? Where are you at on this game, which you have already announced?
It is number 3 on my list of favorite games of all time. Actually, I came into this game expecting a lot already. I had heard stories about it. I'm a huge walking simulator fan, like Sarah. I know you've been into walking simulators lately. I'm a huge fan. I love an easy game. I love an experience-driven game. I love narrative. A game really has to have narrative to hook me. And I'd heard about the game and knew it was going to be great. And so I approached it, but I didn't realize that it was going to be a game that literally changes the way I look at literature. I mean, I have an English literature degree. I've written books. I learned more and better appreciated literature by playing this game. I should say equal amount as my entire college education, honestly. There's so much in here that really helps. It does something that games can only do uniquely, and that's give you an experience and allow you to interpret that experience and learn from it on your own way. And this puts you in a place where you can truly understand the power of narrative in a way that reading about it, the way that even watching a movie about it couldn't necessarily do. This game does that very uniquely, and it does a lot of things uniquely, which I'm sure I'll talk about later on, but it blew my mind. So it's fantastic game.
Excellent. So Ryan, this was your first time playing the game, right?
Correct.
What were your overall impressions?
So I really liked it. I've been wanting to play a nice, relaxing game for some time. I've been kind of playing some more challenging ones recently. So I want a nice breather of a game, and this game kind of filled that need. I got some creepy vibes from it right off the start. I mean, the title is called What Remains of Edith Finch, so you already know that Edith Finch is dead. Now, I didn't know if I was playing as Edith Finch. Then and you eventually find out that you are Edith Finch. But I was coming to.
Are you though? Hold on. Well, I have some thoughts on that. We'll get to, but
sure.
But not call that truth just yet.
Okay, but yeah, I loved how the story kind of it's like you're peeling away at the onion here, and you don't know much at first, but the more you peel away, the more the story unfolds. The game doesn't overstay its welcome. I knocked it out within 2 hours on my stream when I streamed it on a Monday a couple weeks back. That was great. I love the different tones, how every story seems to have a different tone to it. And, I heard a lot of good things going in this game that didn't affect my overall feelings. And I don't think it was overhyped. I still really enjoyed this game.
Great. We are going to be all on the same side of the equation on this game. I too liked this game a whole lot. And it's not often that games elicit an emotional response out of me. And this game did that on a few occasions, and we'll kind of get into. I'm sure I'm not unique in that, but it cements kind of that feeling about how impactful a game can be. For a game that's as compact as it is, again, only about 2 hours. It took me about the same amount as Ryan, and that I felt like I walked into this world that was just lived in and just rife for the investigating and being able to seek it out. And so, yeah, overall feelings though, I really, really liked it. I don't know if I would put it in my top 3,
you're wrong.
like a Caleb, because I am wrong. But it is certainly one of the best experiences that I've had over the past couple of years. This was my second time
That's good.
actually playing through it. So knowing some of the story beats that were coming, they're still just as impactful on the second playthrough as they were on the first. And yeah, we'll dive into that here.
And I can really quickly just say too, one of the reasons, and I fully admit this, that I was so just impressed with this game is just my love of books and literature and things like that. And I think that did allow me to definitely embrace it a little bit more. When you first go into this house, you get in through the doggy door and you kind of walk into the kitchen, and the kitchen is full of books, stacked of books all over. Now, who has that many books in a kitchen? So that was already kind of weird and jarring. Then you keep going through the house and you realize there's more books and there's more books. And then there's one door just to the right of the front door in the lobby that's a little bit unique. It's the first time you see a really unique looking doorway. It's all sealed up. You don't really know what's going on. And immediately when I saw that, I got this. A couple things came to mind. There's a book called House of Leaves, which is just a fantastic, crazy book. But I was speaking with Ian Dallas, the creative director of the game, and he confirmed, House of Leaves was definitely a big inspiration. In fact, he had for a while planned, and the entire end of the game would be a ripoff of House of Leaves, and he just couldn't find a way to make it work. And so he ended up giving up on that, but he was really inspired by that. And there's a lot of books by an author named Jorge Luis Borges, which is one of my favorites. He's Argentinian. He worked in libraries his whole life, and he's written a lot of stories and novels about the power of books and literature and things like that. And one of his collections is called Labyrinths, I think it is. And it literally is like a maze of books. And so you see, like, that's what you're actually seeing here. So this was an opportunity for me to almost experience a connection to literature that I've never been able to experience before. And so for me, that was super unique, and that was incredible. And that definitely sucked me in. So I will be praising this game a lot. All I ask is that you listeners understand that I understand I'm probably a fanboy about it. So I'll go on and on and on about it, but it took me right from the start. And one other thing I'll mention before we kind of move on to the other things is when I was talking to the creative director, he said, the original impetus to the entire game was the idea of, he wanted to create something that elicited the sense of the sublime, that basically you're in awe of nature. You're in awe, but scared kind of at the same time, this idea of sublime. And it was originally going to be a scuba diving simulator. And when you think about that, you're like, okay, I can see it. If I'm scuba diving in the ocean, I'm seeing coral reef and stuff, and I'm seeing all this crazy, basically Abzu, but hyper realistic. And you can kind of navigate everywhere you want to and kind of really go crazy. That's what it was originally going to be, but then that led him down the path of all of these books and this fiction and stuff like that. And so then he started incorporating a lot of that into the books. I'm doing a lot of hand motions, realizing that no one can see me on the camera. All you can see is my giant face. Sorry about that. But yeah, so that was kind of the impetus, and I think knowing that helps probably this conversation. It shines a light on the conversation because what they were going for. They were just wanting to basically paralyze you with beauty. And you see that really when you Sarah, you were talking about seeing the house jutting above the horizon.
Yes.
When you first see that, you're immediately like, that's a little visceral. That's a little grotesque. That's a little weird.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
That's not how houses are supposed to be. Like, that's not, something's dangerous there, and there's something weird, and you want to know more about it. It's secluded from all of society. They talk about that.
Yes.
A little bit in the book, or a little bit in the game. I can say book instead of game. I'm probably gonna do that a lot. The idea that, and this will be something that I talk a lot about moving forward after I pass the mic back over to Musty. Sorry, Musty. I'm just really freaking excited about this game. The houses, they live in this very secluded environment, and you get evidence of homeschooling. So it's this home that really doesn't have a lot of outside contact. And I thought that was an incredibly impressive and smart move to not only show the isolation of the family and sort of, but it also goes to show like how then impacted they would be by the stories that their great-grandmother Edie, kind of passed along about how people in their family die and stuff, because they don't have any outside reference necessarily. There really is, They're almost like a commune in the middle of nowhere. So they are able to be influenced by these stories. And that'll probably get into my theories of the story, which I'm sure, Musty, you alluded to, you had some theories too. So it'll be cool once we get to the point where we talk about kind of theories of what's really going on. But anyway, I'll shut up because
can I say something?
Yeah.
So when it comes to books, definitely I had a connection with the books myself. I am a book hoarder. My family, my maternal family, my father, my mother, we collected books. We were voracious readers, still am. And our rec room has a whole wall full of books. And my father was an academic, and so he read lots. I really identified with those piles of books in a big way. I really did. Yeah.
I really love the way that those built-ins are done. especially the ones that go over the archway of
Oh, I
a
know.
door.
Yeah.
Like it was. I think I may be stealing this term from your interview, but there's like a beautifully grotesque,
Yeah.
right?
For sure.
Ness to it, and so it's just like you look at it, you're just like, this doesn't look right, but it's amazing that it looks the way that it does.
Right.
And yeah, you that starts from the moment that you see the house, which really kind of functions as a character in and of itself, right? And you approach the house, and you can be the traditionalist and go for the front door. You kind of have some a decision to make in that moment, but things funnel you into the home, and you're met with, into the kitchen and the dining room, which strangely, I don't know how long these people have been gone.
7 years, I think she said.
7 years.
Yeah.
Chinese food should not look like that after 7 years.
Yeah.
Chinese food, mind you, from the only place that would deliver food to them,
Yeah.
because of how remote that they were. Nice little elements there to kind of continue that narrative of it being as secluded as it is.
But doesn't it make you feel like, wow, like these people evaporated from the table? Their place setting is still sitting there.
And it's not until the very end when we're already talking about spoilers, but at the end you kind of realize, like, the mother, Dawn, I think was her name, finally got fed up with great grandma Edie and was like, we have to leave now. And like, so they kind of left her and left everyone. Like, so it really was sort of this build up. And what I think that, if I remember correctly, the catalyst was Edith finally got into that weird book archway library room that was sealed off. She got in there, and that was like the last straw. The mother was like, you can't keep essentially affecting my children with these stories that ultimately are their own doom. We got to get out of here,
It was actually Milton that went missing. And then Dawn, sitting at the table, they're eating their Chinese food, says, that's it, we're leaving. And Edie was like, well, you can't escape. You can't keep running away just because this keeps happening. And that's when Edith was excused from the table and went into the library.
Yeah, that's right.
And read the book.
And it's interesting that very moment, I think, was one of the final, I think, really like eye-opening moments, because throughout the entire game, there's this tension between Great Grandma Edie and her stories, whether or not there's an actual curse, because that's what they contextualize it in the game as a curse. Like, that's sort of the mechanic, or not the mechanic, that's the MacGuffin, or whatever the word is, to like basically give credence to all of these deaths. There's a curse. But toward the end, when you realize Edith is writing in a journal, and she realizes as she's writing, like, holy crap, I probably shouldn't be writing this down, because now that I've written it down, I've committed it, and it's now part of the narrative of our story, of our home, of us. Therefore, now I've subjected myself to this curse, essentially. And so she kind of realizes that at the end. And sorry, I think I'm going way over. Like,
this is great.
I love it. I mean, but one thing I was going to say about your comment, Musty, is you talk about how intricate those archways and those coveys are. And I believe that's, you got to think, like, if those books were removed, you could almost realistically see the house crumble. It's almost as though the house is structurally dependent upon those books, meaning the entire house is dependent upon the narrative, the story of those books. Like, and I love the fact that it almost looks as though they literally built the walls out of books. That's insane. So anyway, go ahead.
Deep. That's deep. I love it. Yeah. So to kind of bring us back just a little bit, because I want to kind of set things up. There, you as Edith are returning, right? You're returning to your childhood home, and all you have is this key and her notebook, and she's there to try and figure out what is actually going on here, and to kind of bring some truth to these myths that have been happening, that have been perpetuated through newspaper articles and things like that about this family. And you kind of discover this as you go through. And so Edith manages, with her key, to end up locating in, I think it was Walter's room, the first of what are many hidden entrances and paths throughout this house, which is a crazy concept to me, that you could live in this house for what I assume would be at least 10 years of her life, and have her not find these, or not stumble upon these in any way.
Well, she did make a point. She did make a comment about how she thought all house. Again, keep in mind this family's secluded. They're homeschooled. They don't know how other houses work. And she said in there at some point, she goes, I thought all houses had sealed off doorways and sealed off things that people couldn't enter. And so I think when you first go into Walter's room, I would imagine that at one point that door probably was sealed and like she just never went in there because that's how houses work. You're not supposed to go in these rooms and they're sealed off for whatever reason. So I was okay with it, but I see kind of your point. Like,
I don't think it was ever sealed because
Oh.
Edith said that she spent a lot of time in there playing.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Yeah. Okay. Never mind then.
But she never had the key, and she never thought to then look at that one spot.
Yeah,
she
she had this key and she tried. Well, I had her try the front door, and she's like, "Oh, that would be too easy." And of course, it didn't work.
But
So trying to figure out,
later. So
yeah.
Anyway,
yeah, so I mean, as a child, if I saw a padlock, I was conditioned to not mess with it, and so that's probably what's going on there. I'll let it slide. I'm not going to jump on minute minutia like that. But once she discovers that she has this mechanism to then discover all of these things, and so as she's going through these rooms of her deceased relatives, these rooms have been effectively sealed off for years and years, a very long time in some cases, with some of her like prior generation family members. But we figure out by looking at these sort of shrines how these individuals spent their last moments. And so one of the questions I was going to ask the panel here is, being as these are playing through the head of that individual, what's it like to be in the head of somebody that maybe not in the first story, but as you start to go, the moment that you're in this person's head, you're like, yeah, this is going to be it for this person, and I'm living that. Sarah, what I guess what's that like?
A bit morbid. I feel a bit morbid. How do you feel? I don't know. I didn't like go into their skin or anything. I just took it as it came. I don't know. Caleb, what do you do?
I think it hit me with Gregory's story, which we'll talk, I'm sure we'll get to that, because that was the first time for listeners that Gregory died at 1 year old, less than a year old.
Right.
Definitely the youngest death. And you do play through the deaths of all these characters. I think you might have said that, Musty, but I just want to re-verify. But that was the first time that I was like, it would finally hit me that you play video games and you're conditioned that characters die. Like that's a very common lose condition. Characters die. In this case, it's not a lose condition, it's a progress condition. So I was like, when I played Gregory's story, which was the baby, I was like, there's no way they're going to kill this baby. Like someone else is going to die, but I'm just going to see it through the baby's perspective. Or,
is that better or worse?
It probably neither. But then but when I started playing it, I'm like, oh God, no, they're not going to do this. They're not going to make me play this baby and get killed as this baby. And what's crazy is immediately when I started playing that level, when I started playing it, I almost forgot that the baby was going to die, because it was such a fun, like joyful kind of environment. You're in a bathtub and you're like playing with all the toys and things are going, and you're like completely forget about it. You're like, oh yeah. And then it's not until you like turn on the faucet, basically, which raises the bathtub water and causes the baby to drown. Yeah. It's not until that I'm like, oh God, yeah, that's right. I have to kill this baby. I have to do this. This is crazy. But yeah, it's tough to live through those things. But that's the only way that the story works. Like you couldn't see it from a third person perspective. You have to be a part of that, because that's the one angle of the story that you're not given, is the actual person who lived through it. But what's interesting is, as you live through it, you're still being inundated with the story fantastical elements or those fantastical logic that great grandma Edie would apply to the stories. So, if for example, Molly.
Oh gosh, if you want to talk Molly, okay. I have to say that when Molly was on the scene and they were killing her off, I thought this game was going to be about child abuse. Because they sent Molly to bed without dinner. I didn't know what that was about. If Molly misbehaved, nothing was ever told from the beginning of that. She went to bed, she was starving, and she was eating holly berries and she died.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I thought this game's going to be about a family that abuses their children, and that's how people die. And I have to say, if you're wanting to know, I was a bit upset with that whole thing. I don't like to, and Gregory, when he died, like, I don't like children dying, really, like the young ones.
What a stance to take, right?
Right. So, but thankfully it wasn't about child abuse.
Yeah. And but I think Molly's story, and it's important that's the first story, because that allows you to accept the death as either legitimately a curse, legitimately something fantastical, or it's the first window in which you can sort of see how Great Grandma Edie would construe the death and give it a story, give it a legend to make it a little bit more digestible, right? Because
exactly
at the end of it, you're like, how did she die? Well, you said the holly berries, and that's what I think too. She ate some holly berries and they poisoned her and she died.
And a full tube of toothpaste.
And a full tube of toothpaste, which probably didn't
which
help.
at the time, I don't know that toothpaste was necessarily something that should be
you're
consumed
right.
in that type of quantity.
Like 40s or 50s, right? Like
lots of fluoride in that.
Yeah. So basically at the end of it, like her story is that she was eaten by this tentacle monster, right? Like, but the reality is that she died by eating these poison berries or toothpaste. And so that's the first glimpse when you get like, okay, there's a real way she died, but then there's this legend, this infused story about how they died. And I feel like that's a perfect representation of every story, because every single one of the stories is there's a real way the person died, but then there's also the story way. And that's what leads to this idea of a curse. Because I think if you take a far enough step back, I don't know that all of those people who died in the house is really that crazy. I mean, you got to imagine it started from like the 20s, I think, to like the 2000s. And how many people died? 8, 9, 10. That's not that many people, really. It just happens to be that it's in a pretty narrow like tree, and so and all these stories make it seem very fantastical, but I don't think it's that fantastic. I'm not a death expert, but I don't think it's that crazy. But yeah, anyway.
Well, they're also in their bubble. They're not exposed to normal death. You know, natural causes, things like that. There's a lot of accidents. Like a lot of things go really wrong here.
And look at the way the house is built. Of course, there's going to be accidents. Like, these people aren't safe. That's true.
Yeah, there's a fair amount of Murphy's Law that kind of goes into this. That you know, just they're putting themselves in these situations.
There's irony too. There is irony.
Very true. Very true.
So, anyways, if we go into Walter, especially, there's a bit of irony there.
I do want to save Walter until we talk about Barbara, but let's kind of dig into some of our favorites. I actually do want to riff on Molly a little bit more, being as she's the first story, and she's we kind of hit on the fact that she's of the stories. It's one of the more just kind of wild ones, because I believe she's hallucinating. She believes she has turned into a cat, and then turned into I think it's a falcon or an owl.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the owl first. Yeah.
And then she turns into a shark flopping around in the forest, and which is one of the, I don't know, to me that's one of the more hilarious moments there, because like almost inevitably you get hung up on a tree. I don't know if like. And there's a fair amount of this throughout where it's almost like you're getting funneled into something happening that is intentional, but you still feel like you have the illusion of choice. But yeah, like there's one tree that you almost like. I watched when Ryan did it. I watched when I did it, and we both hit the same tree and had to like flop ourselves to like get moving again, and then roll across the street, and then land in the ocean. And I don't know. I found that one particularly fun. It gets kind of weird when you turn into like a tentacle monster. I don't know what to think about that. And then coming out of the toilet, like
I'm just gonna say really quick here that I didn't realize what was going on, because this was very early on in the story. Is she the first book you read with her?
Yes.
I didn't realize exactly what was going on. Like the whole her dying of the berries and toothpaste went over my head completely until you start seeing more and more stories reveal as the game goes on. Then I'm like, oh, because she kept saying she's having a hard time breathing, I believe, too, right?
She said her stomachs were growling. She was like, all of my stomachs are growling and they're all hungry. So I think she was probably feeling like pain in her stomach, pain in her gut, probably.
I was almost wondering if those berries weren't actually holly berries, but they were like plastic.
That's what I thought. I thought they were
She might have
plastic
been
ones.
choking on them.
Oh, that's possible. Although that would exclude the hallucination though, because like you kind of need the poison to hallucinate, right?
Fair enough.
I don't
Yeah.
know. What kind of toothpaste they have in the 40s.
Exactly. That's what Musty was saying. Yeah, it's true. It's very true.
But like I said, that stuff didn't catch on right away because her storytelling, you're changing from one animal to another. That stuff just kind of was. I wasn't thinking about it because I'm a cat now. I'm like, oh, okay, and then it's just one of those things that.
And she was young, so it's like you kind of
your
saw it
kid's
as
imagination.
like, yeah, exactly, fantasy and imagination stuff. Yeah.
Mm. But yeah, and then eventually, I don't mean to bring this back to Gregory, but by that point in time, I'm already on the board the kill train here. I'm like, oh, how am I gonna kill this next person? And then I'm like, the sequence opens up and you're a baby in a bathtub. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
well, let's get this over with because this is gonna be horrible.
That's the magic of it, though. I mean, like every element of this game is so perfectly orchestrated. Like Molly's story would only work as the first story. If it was the sixth story, you'd immediately know right away, oh, she's gonna eat holly berries and die. Like you would just know. And if it was as fantastical as it is late in the game, you wouldn't buy it because by that point, late in the game, you're playing Lewis's story, which I know Musty, you want to talk a little bit about Lewis's story. So you kind of have to, like the way that the stories are paced. It makes me wonder. I wish I would have asked Ian Dallas, like, did they just have these ideas for story beats and then they decided which order they would work in, or did they instead, like, how would they actually came across that? Because that would be interesting. But I didn't, so time wasted.
Well, and there's some of the stories that there's a fair amount of foreshadowing that happens. One of the examples being the giant slide out front.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The dragon-shaped slide. You see it, and in the moment you're just like, well, okay, that's strange. And then later on, you come to find that Edie was telling people that her husband was crushed by a dragon, or eaten by, or killed by.
I actually wrote that down because that was the moment when the entire game changed for me. Because that's when I realized Edie is all about imbuing legend and imbuing story to the family, and giving credence to the deaths rather than letting people die in vain. It's letting people die with some sort of heroic, legendary status. And the actual quote was from Edith's perspective. She says, when Edie told people Sven was killed by a dragon, she could also have said he was building a dragon-shaped slide that collapsed. She could have, but she didn't. And that's so important. Like, she consciously did not say that because she wants this legend. She wants the story around why people die. It was a big deal.
It might be a cultural thing too, because the family originally originated from Norway, and there's a lot of like Norse, Viking type of maybe ideology there, like and maybe that's what they're doing is Edie was trying to infuse a little bit of that kind of history into her family, make them legends. Yeah,
I wonder if there is a clash between myth and between myth and what's the word? Not explicit, literal. Like if there's a clash between the myth of the old world, quote unquote, and the literalness of America. I wonder if there's probably a tension there, and that's probably why Dawn ultimately took her kids and was like, I got to get the hell out of here. Milton's gone, and you're trying to say, rather than try to help find Milton, great grandma Edie, you're saying, oh no, it's he fell into a painting. Like, come on, like, can you help? Maybe instead of telling people he fell into a painting, that'd be kind of helpful. So that's probably like the last straw. But yeah, I like that idea.
And it's interesting with the family tree the way it is, and with Edie effectively outliving all of her, maybe that's her coping mechanism, is that she's incapable of dealing with the reality of it, and it has to be, has to be this kind of myth to it.
Possibly. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, because that is true. Yeah, she did outlive everyone. Yeah. Huh. Interesting.
We think she might still be alive.
That's true. Well, then she still outlived everyone, right?
Oh, yes. Yes, actually, that would be true.
Except her tombstone did have a date on it, did it not?
Oh,
I'd hope so, because a tombstone without an end date is kind of a creepy, weird tombstone.
Yeah. Well, but however, this weird family didn't build the house until the cemetery was in
Right.
place. So I don't know.
And I love that Edith was conscious of that. I think her quote was, I didn't write this one down, but I think it was like, what kind of family builds a cemetery before they've completed the house? I'm like, yeah, that's true. And then there's the pet, and she was like, there's a pet cemetery. And she's like, that's creepier than the people. And it's really cool because you can actually go through and like read the tombstones and actually like
Derpy and Burpy and
all the symbols. Yeah. And then the goldfish name was Christopher, which that was Molly's goldfish. And then Edith's kid, I think, is named Christopher. So it's like there's this almost like it's not just a story that's passed down generation to generation. It's also names. Edith is named after Edie. I mean, there's names that are passed down. They're trying to hold on to this legend, this myth, this linealogy that, it's just peppered throughout. I love it.
So let's talk a little more about we've each kind of picked a couple of our favorites as far as these stories, but I think in general you kind of have a feel for what we have going into this. We'll kind of wrap things. We'll come back to like the end kind of realizations after this, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to talk about some of our favorites, and so we've kind of alluded to a few of them, but let's just kind of go down the list that we have here because I think they're kind of in order of how they're addressed. But Caleb, you mentioned Calvin's story as being one that you were particularly fond of, or maybe just it was one of your favorites for reasons that I would like to talk about now.
Yeah, it's one that a lot of people I've talked to about this game don't really find that impactful, to be honest. But to me, it made sense from a lot of different perspectives. So Calvin is the twin brother of Sam, and they share a room. Calvin is really into space. He's into being an astronaut and he wants to fly to space, and that's sort of his thing. I would say he's probably like 10-ish or so years old, maybe a little less, maybe 7 or so. And so Calvin's story is you're immediately put into the body of Calvin, as you are with all of the stories, and you're sitting in a swing. And the reason why this story was so impactful is because, one, it really showed the developers' strength with game mechanics. Like, so up until this point, there's not a whole lot of tutorializing. There's not a whole lot of direction. Even from the opening scene, you have to sort of intuit how to turn pages in a journal. Like, it doesn't say press R and the left analog stick to turn a page. Like, you kind of have to just know, like, okay, I got to actually move an analog stick to turn a page and kind of stuff. So you're already primed to do a lot of that stuff manually. But this was the first time that it really, like, I felt anyway, put you in the body of the person in a way that video games can only do. And so you're immediately put into a swing. And the narration, Edith's narration is, something about like Calvin always wanted to go to space. He always wanted to fly. And he decided that today was going to be the day that he truly did it, that he went to space, that he flew. And you're in a swing set. And so you are, from a kid brain, you got to put yourself in the position of a kid, of a 7-year-old or whatever. What's the most logical way I could think to get to space as a 6-year-old sitting in a swing? Well, I'm going to swing as high as I possibly can and go over the bar. That's the legend that all kids have. So even in this particular situation, there's legend upon legend. It's like a meta legend where there's the legend of the family, but then also this kid is adhering to these like childhood legends. And so he's like, I got to go over the bar. And so you're sitting in there. It's not giving you any prompts. It's not telling you what to do. And then so you start moving the joysticks as you would, the analog sticks as you would. And you realize that as you move the right analog stick, the right foot kind of kicks a little bit. You move the left analog stick, the left foot kind of kicks a little bit. So you're trying to move them all wobbly. You're trying to go fast and it's like nothing's happening. And then you realize, oh, I've got to pump like a child on a swing. And so you've got to sort of move the sticks back and forth and to sort of get that momentum going. And once you realize that, you're like, oh my God, I'm in this kid's head. I'm like figuring this out. And now you're like this willing participant where you're having to continue to pump your legs to, by this point in the game, you realize you're killing the kid. Like the kid's going to die. So you're, as a player, having to pump your legs because you want to see the next beat in the story. But you know that by doing so, you're eventually going to kill yourself somehow. You don't really know how yet. But the implication is that you fell out of the swing and probably, broke your neck or hurt yourself in some way. But it also did a really cool job of not solidifying exactly. I think this was probably the first time for me in the game where I realized that they were not the developers and the designers were not willing to fully show. They're very against showing you the visceral deaths. Like that's not the point of the game. They don't want to show how you died. They don't want to show blood. They don't want to show guts. That's not what they're about. So at the point of death in all of these stories, something fantastical happens and you're just sort of left to believe what probably happened. So in this particular case, you swing over the bar a few times and you're like, this is already fantastical. Like, kids, you can't actually swing over the bar. It's like, it's physically impossible. That's not how gravity works. And so,
but who as a kid didn't try this though?
Oh, yeah.
I can for one say, like, I tried to go as high as I possibly could on
every
the
kid
swings.
tried.
Yeah.
But there's no physical way that you could actually go over unless you had help from like rocket boosters or something. Like, you just can't do it. And so, but he did. He went over it. And as soon as he went over the bar, I'm like, okay, now I'm in the fantasy zone. Like, all of the rest of the stuff that happens in this is not real because that can't happen. And so then, of course, you swing over it a few more times and then you're like launched off into space and you're kind of floating in space. But actually you probably fell and you're probably dead. And you're not actually.
And that's what happens when you build a swing set on the edge of a cliff.
Right? That's true. Like, you literally, yeah, that's very true. And what's interesting is if you later on in the game, or maybe even earlier, honestly, I can't remember, there's a point when you are able to explore the backyard, quote unquote, of the house. The entire house is surrounded by backyard essentially, but you're able to explore it and you can actually see the swing all knotted up and tied up in the tree. And you can see the result of a lot of things. There's Gus's story. He's the guy who flew the kite and tore up everything. You can see the result of that event before you actually even experience Gus's story, which is really, really, really cool if you're paying attention to it. So it's one of those games that it does. I mean, for as much as you think a replay wouldn't make sense, a replay totally makes sense. You can see a lot of interesting, cool things. But that's why I loved Calvin's story because of that, because it really showed me a little bit about game mechanics. I think there's a lot in this game that really thrives on learning about, or that showcases its ability to understand game mechanics. Another, I'll toss back to the interview with Ian Dallas, but he talked about when you first enter the doggy door, you're not able to exit the doggy door. So this is toward the very beginning of the game. You get into the house through the doggy door. You're not able to leave the doggy door. And he said there was like a heated debate in the offices about, like, should you be able to leave the doggy door or not? And ultimately you can't, because of streaming issues. Like, you can't, because you have to load a certain amount of data, because there's no load zones in the game. So you have to load a certain amount of data. And that was a very logical point where once you enter the doggy door, you could load a bunch of data and get rid of, it's called the garbage collector. Basically, you delete a bunch of stuff you don't need anymore. And so they were able to delete all of the outside of the house stuff, and they didn't want to have to reload that when you try to go back. And so you can't do that. But this was another, this was just sort of another situation where they just like kind of really understood how game mechanics work. And I don't know, there's a lot of other examples, but I will pass it along.
Yeah, there was a point after your interview with Ian where you and Scott talked about the game for a bit, and you brought up Mario 1, Super Mario Brothers, as an example of exactly that effect, right? You couldn't go back to the left because it had already been dumped effectively. But yeah, that was a very interesting to hear it from the dev side of things, because usually it just feels like a limitation to us.
Right.
One thing before we get off Kelvin, I just want to say I did like the one line that they mentioned that his brother didn't like, was it vegetables? That he'd rather die before having another one of the vegetables again in his life, and he did. Something said, like,
that's true. Yeah, you're right.
That's one little line. Maybe it's a throwaway line, but as a picky eater, I liked it a lot. You know.
Well, and there was also, I mean, it's also like sort of a case study. I'm sort of an armchair game developer. I've never developed any games that would be at all considered good, but I have fun doing it. And it's a case study in like how to cram a bunch of things into one thing. So you'll also notice not only is the writing great, like you pointed to just now, Ryan, but also you notice he has a cast. Calvin does. So you know he's a risk taker. You already know he's a risk taker.
He's probably already tried to do this once.
Exactly. And what's funny is you mentioned the I'd rather eat another vegetable. That happened right when, I don't know if it was Edie or who it was, but yelled basically, "Come in for dinner. It's time for dinner."
Yeah.
And so that's when he dies. Like he literally did die seconds before he would have eaten Brussels sprouts, so, or whatever it was. I might have said, yeah. But I don't know. I loved it. The one other thing I'll mention real quick about it is, so I try to think that I know what's going on in the game. Like when I was talking to Ian Dallas, I was fanboying out. I'll be honest with you. If you listen to the interview, it's cringeworthy because I was such a fanboy about it. But I asked him, I said, there's a lot of transitions between scenes that are very Halo-like. It's basically a circle, you're going into a light, and that's sort of the transition. When you come up from the toilet, from the monster, the tentacle monster in Molly's story, it's kind of a halo, you're going to the light. Walter, when you exit the downstairs area, I think that's Walter, right? With the guy who was down in the basement for like 30 years or whatever, he exits and he comes into the sunlight and there's a train that hits him. Like all of these things, I'm like, well, you're transitioning from like a earth state to a heaven state, right? And he was essentially like, no, we just know how to do like Halo effects.
Bloom
like,
effect, yeah.
Yeah, the bloom effect. He's like, no, sorry to burst your bubble, but that's just what we do. And there's a couple others, which maybe as we get toward the end of the game, I'll talk about. But I love the fact that like they're using their limitations as a feature. It's not a feature. It's not a bug. It's a feature kind of thing, So
very good. Now you brought up Gus's story, and Sarah, this was one that you had indicated was one of your favorites. You want to kind of talk about Gus?
Yeah. So in the story, we have Gregory, who was the baby that drowned, and basically was the impetus it put a wedge between Gregory's father and mother, Sam and Kay, and they eventually separated and divorced. And the children that were left were Dawn and Gus. And Sam found another beloved and decided to get married. And the kids just didn't like her. And basically Gus's scene has them at the beach, at the shoreline by the house. And Sam and his new wife, or new to-be wife, get married on the beach under a tent. And Gus is being a ruffian, a 13-year-old ruffian who just doesn't want any part of this. And he has an obsession with kites. He likes to fly kites. And that's a bit tongue in cheek too, because, he doesn't want to be part of it. Sort of like somebody saying, go fly a kite and you just watch me. I'm going to fly that kite.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I like that.
And so he decides he's going to step away from the ceremony and just do his own thing, fly a kite. And it was nice when they started the ceremony, but slowly but surely a storm starts rolling in. And while that's happening, a poem written by Dawn that explains Gus's demise is displayed on screen. And pretty much what you see is from the perspective of Gus holding on to the kite reins. And you are made to navigate this kite through the text that is shown on screen. And it's so cool that once the storm starts rolling in, objects that were on the beach start flying up into the air and whipping around and catching on the kite, including chairs and other objects. They fly all over the place. And there's one point in the poem where the wind whips up and Sam says, turn up the music, make the music louder, or something to that effect. Basically saying, everyone get in the tent and let's ignore what's happening outside. And let's have a good time. And here, Gus is having his own party outside. And pretty much this torrential storm comes in, whips all sorts of things around, lifts the tent up off of its stakes, starts flying around the air, and the next thing you know, you can only assume that the tent hits him, or he gets hit by that and some objects. We're not exactly sure, and he basically gets killed by a flying object. I'm assuming it's the tent, but I can't be sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they closed that with the tent coming at him fairly strong. Now, there is one point in that I remember where you have to almost pull text off of the totem pole.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
that's right next to him. Earlier, I think you walk through an area and that totem pole is on the ground.
Mhm.
Yeah, and some people surmise that the totem pole fell on him, but I don't know. I'm just taking it at face value. It looked to me like it could have been anything, because a big storm had blown through,
Yeah.
and objects were flying everywhere, and he obviously was hit by something.
Mhm.
But I identified with that boy. I really did. In my own personal life, I mean, my mom was widowed, and she started dating a man about 4 years later. And of course, we were two little kids. We didn't like this big, tall man coming into our house and taking over and watching our TV and all the rest of it. And we really put my mom and my now stepfather through the gears. We really did. We didn't like this guy invading our space. And of course, they got married when we were adults, so it was all cool and everything. But when I was 8 years old, I didn't like this stranger coming into my house, and I sort of identify with Gus, and the whole you could hear Sam in the background. Hey, you come over here and take a picture with the family right now. I was kind of a sullen teenager too, and I was like, oh, pictures, come on, like I never gave my family the middle finger
while flying a kite.
but like I identified with that feeling of despondence and like, who do you think you are? And I don't want to be a part of this, and showing my protest. I can identify with those feelings. And of course, when you're a teenager, you have all sorts of hormones happening, and you're emotional. You don't know how you're feeling from 1 minute to the next. So yeah, I like that part of the game. I definitely did.
Excellent.
And what's interesting too is if you think about the position he was put in, which caused him to die, it was his aversion to being part of the family that made him die. And so it's almost like, if that truly is a tale from Edie's perspective,
yep, it
makes sense, because she's trying to create these myths, these legends to keep the family together. And she's basically saying, hey, because Gus wasn't a quote unquote team player, he's dead now. So you might want to, be part of that. So I thought that was kind of interesting too, that he was the only one that feels he's so isolated. Like, other people die trying almost to be part of the family. Walter is a good example, but it's just kind of interesting that he died because he was not willing to be part of the family.
Yeah, he's in a way asserting his independence.
And that's what was his downfall.
13-year-old. Yeah. Anyways.
Excellent. No, that's great. Ryan, I want to throw to you, because the next story we want to talk about is one that you indicated was your favorite, along with friend of the show, Dean from Round 2 Gaming, mentioned Barbara's story as being one that's really stood out. So why don't you tell us a little bit about our child star, Barbara, and her eventual demise.
Yeah, so Barbara, she, is a child actress, or she was a child actress. She was famous for her scream and appearing in horror films. I can't remember the era where it was that she was famous around, but kind of like maybe the introduction of the monster flicks, like your Wolfman and whatnot. And then as she got older, she lost her scream, so she kind of drifted away. She became her one-trick pony actor, child actor, and she got older. The acting gigs went away. Eventually, then this you find out by I believe checking her gravestone. You find out from the time that where she died, she was about 16 years old. So she was kind of becomes this kind of a classic horror trope. So her story essentially is kind of told through a horror comic. Kind of it reminds me of I believe Marvel did some of these back in the day, where they have creep show stories, if you will, where it's a short story. Like a comic book.
And Tales from the Crypt had like comic books too for a while too.
Yes. And that's very much the vibe I got from her story. So much so that I thought old Jack, the narrator of her story, was maybe the Crypt Keeper.
Oh yeah, I never thought about that. I wonder.
Sally, I'll tell you right now, it's not.
Oh dang it.
Yeah, so I had to look into it because that was one thing that I was like, that's him. That's a fantastic touch. No, but it isn't. But the guy's doing a pretty good impersonation of the Crypt Keeper. And you know, there's some great homages in this part right there, which he when they tell her story that she kind of gets kind of a second boost in her career by attending horror shows where people want to get her pictures taken with her, and her boyfriend, who's actually a super fan of hers, is trying to help.
Ian Dallas, by the way.
I did not know that.
Oh, was he really? That's...
Yeah.
He's trying to help her get her scream back. So essentially this horror story comes upon her, and you start hearing the Halloween theme from John Carpenter movie, and I thought that was a really nice touch.
That was. I like that.
Eventually, it leads to kind of her. Was she murdered, or was she just disappeared? Because eventually, it ends kind of with being surrounded by what she thought were super fans, but kind of were ghouls, right? But
so there were some radio broadcasts that happened throughout there where they were saying that there were, I don't know if
masked man with a hook on his hand.
That's right.
They said it was a group of two individuals, and then they said it was a masked man with a hook. And I don't know. I mean, not that you should take to the internet, but there's some that theorize different things. They say that it was a serial killer, a cult came in and murdered her, and then something as simple as a home invasion. So who knows, right?
Yeah, because did her boyfriend die too, or he just disappeared?
Because boyfriend disappeared and then was blamed for it.
Okay.
That's Steve. All the while Walter was under the bed, right? Like
right. Poor Walter.
we'll come to Walter in a minute because that has some impact on that.
But yeah, so she kind of goes through, you know, being stalked by this guy chasing her through the house, and eventually leads to her death at the end. But she lives the trope of every horror film for the 80s, at least, that she's a teenager and there's someone in the house chasing after her, a monster, if you will, stalking her through the house. But no, it's they make you kind of live this trope, and I thought it was a fantastic touch. I have a tendency here on the Cartridge Club to always kind of like the horror theme levels to see the DuckTales episode.
We got that's 3 months in a row now.
So yeah, so as soon as I saw that, I was like, this is, I don't know, it was right in the wheelhouse of what I enjoy. Barbara was the one that stood out the most for me.
Yeah, and she kind of got her, like, that was her moment, right? The whole, like, she's been struggling to recreate this thing that made her famous when she was young, and then in this final moment, she nails the performance, right? Or that's how the story portrays it. But her story was actually published this way.
Yeah, which I thought was weird. Like, yeah, it was literally a Tales from the Crypt sort of legend that was published. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, that's
I was just
it's strange because all the other ones are creations to some extent of other storytellers. This one is like a published work on top of it, which is just kind of bizarre.
Do you thinking of Barbara's death, like the ear, do you think the severed ear in the music box has anything? What's the symbolism behind that?
I don't know. I think it just has to do with the sound of the scream, because it was the sound of the scream that really made or broke her career. And so short of, like, if from a design perspective, or I guess from a logic perspective, it might make more sense if it was like her throat in the thing. But from a visual perspective, you're not going to recognize what the inside of a throat looks like. Like, so they probably had to find something that was recognizable. And I think that's probably where the ear came from. That's my guess anyway.
Maybe it's a nudge, wink, play it by ear.
Maybe. Yeah, exactly. He did say that. That's right.
Maybe.
Yeah. So maybe he was the killer after all. Rick, that jerk boyfriend.
I thought it was Steve.
No, it's Rick, I think. It's got to be Rick, right? I'm going to look this up. You carry
I
on
think
with
it's
your...
Rick, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, Team Rick.
Steve doesn't. Yeah, no, it's got to be Rick.
Okay.
Ron, Rick, something. Yeah.
That'll
Fair
teach
enough.
you, Musty, to...
I don't know. It seems like something a Steve would do.
You're right. I don't... A Steve or a Chad, probably, right?
That's great. So tying this to the ear, the one person who would have heard this scream and lived to tell the story
That was a good segue. I just got to pause for a
one.
moment. That was pretty good.
is Walter, right? And so Walter is Barbara's younger brother, who she was babysitting. That
Youngest.
youngest
Mhm.
brother. And so
Little-
Walter
little-
kind of takes it kind of, it impacts him quite a bit. And so
Mhm.
Sarah, you kind of claimed this one, so I want to let you have some time to talk about what kind of happened to Walter after that whole event, and then again how he kind of the rest of his life plays out.
So during that evening when Barbara was killed, he was hiding under the bed. Yeah, and he was just a young lad. He's the youngest born, and frankly, a little freaked out. And basically, he went into the basement. I guess Edie built him a bunker in the basement, and that's where he stayed from 1968 to 2005. He just lived in the basement. And I found that interesting too, because you go into his bedroom, his childhood bedroom is the first room that you access before you go into Molly's room. And it's pretty much empty. And it hasn't been sealed. You go down into the basement, into the bunker, and you start to feel a little bit claustrophobic.
Mm-hmm.
You see that there are cans. Basically, it's what do they call that? A prepper?
Doomsday prepper.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a prepper.
Bombshell bunker.
Yeah, exactly. You see all kinds of food and rice and what have you, and you kind of make your way through a tunnel, and then you access a doorway, and then Walter's story begins. And basically, it just kind of quickly shows that a day in the life of, which really doesn't change too much every single day. I mean, every day at noon, there's what you know is a train, but he calls a monster beyond the door. And he eats peaches and he listens to the radio. And for every era that passes, and the way that you know this is through a calendar, they have a calendar posted on the wall. Every year that passes, it's the radio changes its music of the era. So in the 68, you have sort of like, I don't know what, the Yardbirds or something, that kind of music. And then you find yourself in the disco era. And then sooner or later you find yourself in 2005, and there's a bit of grunge in the on the radio. He's still eating the same peaches. He's still hearing the train go by until one day the train stops. He doesn't hear it. And he waits a week and it's total silence. And he just gets sick and tired of sitting there, rotting, waiting for this train to go by. He decides, that's it. I've had enough of this. I'm going to go. I am going to go out there and I'm going to discover what life is about. And he, even if it's a month, a year, a month, a day, I just want to go out there. And so he breaks through somehow. There isn't a doorway or anything, but he sort of has to break through a wall.
It was like a wall of bricks, right?
Right. And he ends up out there and he basically says, I want to feel the sun on my face. And just when he says that, a train goes by and kills him. Or
not the
what
sun,
we think
that's the
is a train,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
You see the light come and it sort of right,
Yeah.
and it's sort of shocking that way. Now, there are certain theories around whether or not it was a train, because he breaks the wall and he ends up in some sort of tunnel, and it has train tracks on it. And he proceeds to walk out of the tunnel, and this whatever train goes in and hits him, or so we think. But as Edith, when you're going through the bunker and you go out, there's actual train tracks, and if you walk further past the tunnel, you do find Walter's shrine.
Mhm.
But beyond that, you see that the train tracks end right at the precipice of a cliff. Like there was once train tracks there. And if you even look beyond, down below, you could see the remnants of tracks there. It was almost like there was a tsunami or a storm or something that washed part of it away.
Or maybe he even like walked. If the train track was already gone when Walter came out, maybe he just was so enamored by the sun, he just kept walking toward it and then maybe fell off the cliff or something. Maybe
That's a possibility too.
Huh.
Now, there is some irony to this whole thing. When Walter was a little kid, he was obsessed with trains. Obsessed. Like his whole room was full of train stuff. His door had like the crisscross railway.
Oh, yeah.
There were trains on the curtains. He had toy trains all over the place. So there's a bit of irony in that he gets so-called hit by a train. Like that's how he dies. I'm not sure what's real and what isn't. It could all be fantasy. He could have had a heart attack breaking through the wall. We don't know.
He probably didn't get much exercise down there, so just hitting a wall with a sledgehammer probably would be enough to, give him a heart attack. Yeah.
Like the air was thin up there.
Yeah.
We don't know. We don't know.
It's one of those, that Walter's story is one of the stories that at first I was like, this is unbelievable. How could someone be in a room for 30 years and think that there's a train out, that the sound of a train is a demon or whatever it might be, a monster. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized like he's stunted. Like he went down there at 10 years old. And this prepping environment, this had to have already been created. He wouldn't have created it at 10 years old. So there's already this narrative in their family of prepping for the worst. And so he found this prepping room, got down there, lived there for 30 years. So as a 40-year-old person, he still has the mindset probably of a 10-year-old, which I really think is cool because it's almost a microcosm of the homeschool environment where the entire rest of the thing is talking about how homeschooling, and I don't want to denigrate homeschooling. That's not what I'm trying to do. But like, it's basically saying homeschooling is a sense of like being removed from a larger societal group. This is a microcosm of that. This is like even removed even from the homeschooled microcosm. So like you're even more isolated. And so I kind of finally started, like, it took me a couple playthroughs and I'm like, okay, I guess I buy it. And if you were to break through the wall and see sun for the first time in 30 years, yeah, you might be a little distracted, especially if there's a train coming your way. You might actually fall into that. So it took me a couple playthroughs, but yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, it's quite possible. If you're isolated in a basement like that too, you're a 10-year-old, you wouldn't have much social skills. And there was some inference that Edie was going down there every once in a while to bring him food, probably social interaction through that, probably getting taught, getting taught some school stuff. I mean, how else would he be able to string together a sentence?
Hey, you're right. That's a good point.
But I was a little puzzled too that when he broke through the wall that he didn't realize there were train tracks there. But again, it could just simply be that he was just totally disoriented being out in fresh air.
That's a good point, actually, because you would think that he would know there were train tracks there before.
Yeah.
So like he would have known that's the noise. Yeah.
Like
So it makes
what
makes you question if the train tracks are even like real. I don't know. That's
I even wrote down the monster on the other side of the door.
yeah. He
That's
should
what he
know
was
what that
calling
is.
it.
Huh.
You know,
Yeah, that's a
so
good point.
that was a
But
bit.
he's also dealing with coming off of a trauma, right? And so
Oh, yeah.
he may just
That's
be
true.
having
That's true.
some PTSD, and that is his justification. Maybe.
Absolutely.
That's true.
For this.
Actually, the idea that as a kid you sort of have to justify things in a way that the family is always justifying things, like right, like as a kid you have to almost justify like that's a monster sound, like you're creating these legends in your head the same way that your family is creating a legend. So I guess that kind of makes sense. I guess I don't know.
Anyways, I really enjoyed that character. I thought it was different. I don't identify with him at all, but he is different, and I thought it was really cool. One last thing though, after you walk out and you see the train tracks fall down the cliff, and you continue down a small pathway, and if you look up into the trees, you're Edith at this point. You look up into the trees, you could see the chairs from the wedding stuck in the trees.
Yeah.
So that brings it right back to Gus.
That's right. Yeah,
I
that's
just thought that was
absolutely
cool.
right. Yeah.
But I believe Walter's situation was before Gus's.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of a foreshadowing.
Well, and it's interesting too because this actually brings up a great, like the level design in this game is fantastic. So as you're exiting Walter's area, I believe, is that right before you sort of first experience like the cemetery? Is that accurate? Okay,
that's correct.
That's right.
So you like head toward the cemetery, and you head like the game is telling you to basically go toward this light, essentially, to bring back the whole light analogy. Head toward the light. But once you do that, you're like, now what do I do? Well, if you turn around 180 degrees, you're like, oh, there's another path back there.
You're right.
And I love that this game is built in a way to focus you in one direction. And then it's only when you turn around that you actually see there was another path. The same thing happens when you first go to Milton's artist thing toward the top of the house. Like you go straight toward Milton's thing. And it's not until you leave it and come back that you realize, oh, there's another stairway up. So you could, if you're a real gamer and you sort of want to defy conventions and sort of go in the opposite direction it's telling you to do, you could miss Milton's story entirely. Like there is the possibility of doing that, which I think is really, really, really cool. And that they're so confident in that. I'll ask this question because it's along the same lines. How many of you knew Edith was pregnant before she said she was pregnant? Okay, we got one out of 4 of us.
Not me.
Like, it's crazy because the whole time you could have looked down and seen that you were 22 weeks pregnant.
I did.
But like most people don't do that until she says it. Like you had the capability of seeing something the entire time and you didn't. And that's just a true testament to how great this game is designed.
I looked right down to her feet to see what shoes she's wearing, and because she has these finger gloves.
She has awesome gloves. I know. I want those gloves.
And her nails are well manicured, and of course for the time, like that's what the girls do now. But I was curious to see what she was wearing, just out of curiosity. So I looked down and I noticed her belly was quite protruding, and I'm
did
like, I wonder. Say again?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just gonna say, did that ruin it at all for you? Like, did you get a okay? That's good.
No, like I wasn't sure what to make of it. I'm like, she seems pregnant to me. She seems a little too thin, and she's not malnourished, I don't think. You know what I mean? So, she must be pregnant. I just guessed it. It wasn't until much later when they say, "Yeah, if I'd only known, I wouldn't be jumping on the roof, 22 weeks pregnant." I'm like, aha,
I love that.
Yeah, especially right after Molly's, because you go right out the window and along the gutters there, and it's kind of crazy.
Well, I questioned walking through the doggy door. Then after finding out I was pregnant, I was like,
"That's true. That's a good point." That's a good point. Oh, it was only 22 weeks though, so that's not too bad.
I think the reason why I didn't do it is I'm so used to first-person shooters that are just a camera
Yeah.
set about yay high, right?
That's like the
Yeah.
big tech. That was like the technological achievement, right? Is like when they finally were able to consistently have feet in first-person shooters. You're like, oh man, we're like in the new generation. This is amazing. You can have feet. Yeah. So people still aren't primed to actually expect feet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I ask around the table how people played this game? I played on PC with a keyboard and mouse.
I played
Console.
on. I played
Console,
on.
yeah.
Yeah, I played on the PlayStation 4
So you were using a handheld
controller.
okay,
Mhm.
controller. Okay. It seems to be a habit of mine because I play a lot. Most of the games I play are on PC, and I play a lot with the keyboard and mouse. And just looking down seems to be a lot of the kind of thing that I do. If I'm put into the body of, a first-person game, looking down, that's just something I do. So it was natural for me to look down and notice those things.
Yeah, and I've there's a video. PlayStation Access is a great channel. You all should subscribe to it. It's fantastic, YouTube channel. But they have a Friday feature where Rob, one of their main guys, talks about like the things that gamers do all the time. And one of the things they talked about was like when you play a first-person shooter, like do you look down or do you not? And that sort of determines what kind of gamer you are. And he actually, if I remember correctly, he did say like if you tend to look down right away, you probably have a PC lineage, because that's such a thing that was defining across the generations, is that you would actually have legs, whereas console gamers, because our lineage isn't first person shooters, it's like we're not primed to actually think to do that. And so anyway, that's a shout out, I guess, to PlayStation Access. It's a good channel. Anyway,
That is interesting.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. We've been talking about Edith and pregnancy and babies, because the next story that we wanted to talk about, Caleb, I'm going to let you take this one, but it's one that I think resonates the most with a lot of people just because of the shoes that you're put in. And that is Gregory's story. And Gregory, as we've alluded to already, is the youngest death in this game, and it is one that, well, I'll let you, Caleb, talk about it. But I know that there are people, especially some that have commented on, with their impressions of the game, who just, this is the moment that to them sticks out,
right.
And that's Gregory's story.
And I'll be quick with it. I did talk a little bit about Gregory earlier. I'll be quick with it, but I will also tell all of the listeners to keep listening, because the other story that a lot of people really resonate with is Lewis's story. So I think Lewis's story is probably the coolest and most interesting. So stick around for that, which is next. So Gregory, we've already talked about Gregory being a baby, being young. The reason why it resonated with me is not only because of that, I've already alluded to that earlier, but also because I felt like this was a great, almost like, if you think, let me just come out with it, I guess. It's a great representation of sort of the game at large. So in the same way that Edith or Edie, great grandma Edie, is trying to imbue her family with story and trying to make everything make sense through narrative. And that's actually one of the things that Ian Dallas said as well, is that like story is a way to try to make sense of the unknowable. Like if you can't truly comprehend something, you assign archetypes to it, you assign characters to it, you try to make it understandable through story. And so I felt like Gregory's story was a good representation of that, because we as adults, some of us have kids, I know, when you see a kid do something funny or do something weird, you are approaching that from the perspective of an adult. And you think they're doing this because of XYZ. Like you're trying to categorize and rationalize exactly why a kid is doing something. And so this story of Gregory, who's in a bathtub, immediately, like the first thing you hear is the parents of Gregory talking about how Gregory used to pretend in the bathtub. It looked as though Gregory had this whole scenario going on in his head, and he didn't really truly understand what he was doing with his play, but it looked as though he was having a whole story in his head. And so when you're placed in the head of Gregory, immediately you have this symphony going on, this music, this orchestra that's going on, and all this crazy stuff that's going on. And it's almost like a dance routine where the toys you're playing with as Gregory, you reach out, you grab a toy frog or whatever, and you're playing with this toy, and you're kind of messing around with it, and it makes sense in the story because you're like, oh yeah, Gregory is playing, and we have to, as adults, try to understand why he's playing. Like, rather than just accepting that babies play and that's what they do, like, we as adults have to try to categorize that and understand that. Oh, he's playing with that because he imagines his toys are saying things, or his toys are characters in a play, or whatever it is. And so the entire experience of Gregory is through really the lens of an adult trying to understand and try to appreciate why Gregory is doing the things that he's doing, which I felt that was a microcosm. I've used that term already before, but I'll use it again. It's sort of a microcosm of the entire game, What Remains of Edith Finch. You're trying to assign story to this behavior, to rationalize it, to make sense of it, to understand it. And so when he ends up dying because of the story, essentially, that makes it all the more heartbreaking. It's not just the fact that this 1-year-old is dying, but he's dying. I don't know. This just really, I think, solidified the idea that we assign story to death to rationalize it. And that was big to me. So that's, and plus I was probably a new, I don't know, this game came out, I played this like 2 years ago. My youngest kid was probably 3. And so I still had some of those like fatherhood emotions, I guess. So that probably helped as well, I think. But I love Gregory's story. As much as it's sad, I still love it. And I think it's a pinnacle of gaming, honestly, in general. Like, it's a pinnacle of gaming experience. Outside of this game, every game, it's just fantastic.
Yeah, some of the choreography and like the music, like it's like cinematically beautiful, even though at that point you have a good feeling of what's coming.
Yeah. It's almost like if you've watched old Looney Tunes cartoons, they used to take like public domain Beethoven works and things like that. It's like that, because as a kid, I mean, that's my experience as a childhood. It's Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies and those things where it's just a bunch of shapes and characters moving around to a music track. And I feel like there's something of that in here. Again, something I wish I would have asked Ian Dallas when I interviewed him, but like, I feel like there's something of that in here where they're trying to categorize, they're trying to organize this experience through something that makes sense. And music makes sense to a lot of adults and a lot of people. The logic of music makes sense. So let me categorize the childhood experience through music. And I feel like they were kind of doing that to a degree, because there's no other death in the entire game that relies on music that heavily. So why incorporate it here? Well, they're trying to rationalize how a child thinks. And so I freaking loved it. I loved it. I love baby death. What can I say? That's going to be the clip that you isolate from this whole thing.
Potentially.
Anyway.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and move on to then the last major story that we're going to address, aside from talking about the remainder of Edith's journey, and that is Lewis's story, which is one that I think a lot of gamers in particular really identified with. So Lewis is Edith's brother.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
got to make sure I got those right.
Brother? Yeah,
her oldest brother, and he is a pothead, for lack of a better term. He's his room itself, black lights. I assume those are felt posters and hash pipe in the middle of the room, and just like it just reeked of the aroma. And
it's worth stating too that this house is the perfect house for a pothead. So like, I mean, he like,
wow.
this entire house is like a 10-year-old's dream or a 19-year-old pothead's dream. So
it's not so much pothead. Like, when I looked at the house, I'm like, somebody had been smoking something.
It's
to make that house.
I want to live in that house. As a kid, I dreamed of secret passageways in every room. Like, oh, I want that. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But God, right. It's such a great house to experience. Like, even if everything we've said so far is horrible and you hate it and you're like, this is dumb. If you ever thought it would be cool to have a secret passageway as a kid in your house, play this game, because it's amazing. So anyway,
that's great. So Lewis's story is the story of him actually getting sober, and it's told the words that are spoken throughout his story are the actual letter from his psychiatrist,
That's
who is dealing with the aftermath of getting him some help, which clearly the help didn't fumigate the room or didn't clear that out at all, because Edith walks in and she's like, yeah, it smelled like Lewis. It smelled like I always remembered it, and we play video games together. But Lewis, now sober, is trying to deal with the monotony of life, and he's continuing to work at this cannery. So they're the salmon that they talk about very early in there. There's shelves and shelves of salmon in the can, and so he's working at this place, and his primary job is to take the fish as they come down the pipe and put them into this automated machine that chops the heads off and then move them along. And throughout his story, you get to feel the monotony of this job, because and this is unlike anything from any of the previous stories. The controls in this, I think are what draw you so deeply into this story, because you are controlling his right hand with the right analog stick, and you grab the fish, you move it to the right, chop the head off, throw it. While this is happening, the story is talking about how Lewis was so bored with this, and he was so good at it that there was nothing to it, that he started to develop and daydream at work. And his daydreams start as this sort of top-down, I think Caleb, you and Scott had called it kind of almost an Atari era visual of him sort of just making his way through these little labyrinths and these little paths. And they start to take up just this little corner of the screen. So you're continuing to take these fish, cut the heads off, throw them away. And then as the letter continues on, this world that he's creating for him starts to encroach more and more on reality. At one point, it's taking up half of there, and he starts to make up cities in his name. Lewistopia was one of them. And he built up the city, and he was living this alternative reality at work while he was doing his monotonous job. And so he started to imagine a band following him around and cheering music, and a parade basically forming around him. And he always wanted to kind of seek out this new adventure. Meanwhile, all you're doing is continuing to just chop these fish. And he then decides to go on a journey, and he gets on a boat. And this is where they actually introduce a little bit of choice here, because you can take him down this path, and there's some choices as to whether he would go look to find a prince or a queen, or whether he would go for rainbows or serpents, and what type of music he would go after and seek of, and ends up at a palace. And at this point, there's even some moments with that boat where chopping the fish actually causes barriers in the story to open up for him. Like, I think one of them was actually a drawbridge, and then one of them was just kind of a big, I don't know if it was a dam or something like that, but the moment the fish chops, like, suddenly these two things are becoming fused, and his reality is this living in his imagination. And he's been talking about this with his psychiatrist the whole time as well. Now, Lewis's demise, the moments leading up to Lewis's demise are like this triumphant moment where first he actually sees himself outside of his body in there just kind of working away. And then he goes up the conveyor belt where the fish are going, although you seem to be going up toward this radiant light, which ends up opening into this, in his dream world, this throne room where his prince or his queen are there waiting to crown him. And in that moment, he kneels, he leans forward, and he has his own head removed by the same guillotine that has been cutting off the fish heads this whole time. And I think that moment is so jarring. And I that's, for me, this moment and Gregory's moments were like two where I was just straight up dumbfounded. And replaying that one, like, one of the really cool things about this one is that it actually keeps track of how many fish you cut. And there is a leaderboard on Xbox
Oh,
Live
really?
for the number of
Oh.
fish that you cut. I think on my first playthrough I had like 83. And I didn't check my most recent one, but I feel like I was far more efficient on this one because I don't think I ever had like a bottleneck. I
It's
was
funny
always
that it incentivizes you to do good at the thing that ultimately killed Milton.
Yeah.
Like
Lewis.
Lewis. I'm sorry, Lewis.
Lewis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy.
But there's just something about this story about talking about the, living in the clouds and doing what seems to be too much daydreaming because he was just tired of it. And it's a insane way to end that stretch. So I hope I told it well, and I hope that was not people's first time of hearing this.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because the whole point of that is to make is to demonize monotony, basically saying like doing repetitious tasks could potentially kill you. I'm not saying that's like the overt message, but it's like that's one of the takeaways from it. But in Great Grandma Edie's whole point is to try to remove the monotony from death. Like her whole being is to say, I want to make death unique. I want to make it something, very unique. And so it's almost like as though Lewis's story is like the epitome of like what Great Grandma Edie wants. But at the same time, you get to experience it in a way that Edie would never have been able to experience. You actually get to see it. You get to see him droning on and like moving fish, but not actually moving fish. Like when you mentioned how you step away from the actual first person and you're in third person for a little bit. At that point, you'll notice like Lewis isn't moving fish at all. He's just sort of droning on. And again, you can't see my camera, but he's droning on and on and on and not really accomplishing anything, which I thought was incredibly poignant and incredibly cool. Yeah, it's a really, really cool story. I would like to see almost an entire like experimental game that's like just that. I think there's I think that could be explored even further than it was in this game. But yeah, it's really cool.
So unique.
Yeah,
It's so different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Oh,
and it is the last of the last of the major stories that you get through that. The rest of the story is really told through Edith's perspective and kind of addresses them leaving the house. And so I guess unless there were any other final thoughts on Lewis's story, I think I said my piece. But I really like that story. Like as difficult as that was to realize what had happened, it's the part that I think stuck with me the most out of this game.
Yeah, and you got to think he's trying to justify his own existence through story. Again, it all comes down to justifying something through story, using story to justify the various events that happen in life. And so he's trying to say, I want to justify my life by imbuing this story around it. I'm not Lewis at a cannery. I'm Lewis. I'm a king. I'm this big thing. So he's creating the story around to justify his own existence, which again, I think if I were to step back and say like, what's the pairing in the family that like I would look at and be like, that's a kind of a quirky pairing. It would be like Lewis and Great Grandma Edie. Like they would be these unexpected friends that would just hang out with each other. And like, it would just be like that pairing would be just a fantastic pairing. So I think his story really exemplifies a lot, and it makes sense because it's at the end. I mean, we talked about earlier about like, what's the order of the stories. Lewis's story wouldn't have worked at the beginning. It has to be at the end. It really does. So yeah,
that's fantastic. So we didn't really talk too much about how things. We kind of alluded earlier that there's this moment then with Edith and Dawn where they up and leave and leave, trying to kind of break this cycle that is Great Grandma Edie's, tendency to assign this additional sort of story to everything that's going on in this family's life, and trying to get away from that. And so you leave that and you start to then see what is actually going on here. And it does a strange thing in that all of a sudden you are then in the perspective of Edith's child, this story then is being told to Christopher, this which would be her son. So you kind of have your big. You mentioned a few of these Halo moments.
Mhm.
That's about as Halo moment as you can get
Mhm.
with birth canal and all that. And so there was a point that I was going to make earlier about a suspicion that I had, and that is that I feel like it's possible that this entire game is played as Christopher, and that this is Christopher going through Edith's journal, because at the end you are like you are as Christopher. Now there's one point, and I wish I knew whose hand it was. Although I suspect it's Edith's, but you have your arm out the window,
Mhm.
and you can kind of do that like up and down kind of wave
Yeah.
thing.
Which every kid in the world has
It's her.
done outside their
Absolutely.
window, right?
It's her. It's Edith.
It is Edith in that moment. Okay.
Yeah, because
Part of
she
me was
was
thinking
sitting.
it might have been Christopher on his way there.
Oh.
No,
because she was seated at the table with Edie and Dawn, like, and the two adults were talking about leaving and arguing about leaving, and 10-year-old Edith is sitting there with the chopsticks, and she's wearing the gloves, and she's eating her food with the chopsticks, kind of awkwardly, picking up food with a chopstick in either hand, kind of thing, and eating it like that. And then and she's wearing the same gloves in the
Gotcha.
car.
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
and I have some thoughts on this too, but Musty, I'll let you I don't know if you have a further sort of thoughts on this.
I don't know that I do. It was a thought that I
Well,
had that perhaps.
And I had some thoughts when I was talking. God, I've said this so many times. I feel like a total d-bag. I've when I was talking with Ian Dallas, I brought up the idea of I had some theories, and he basically shut all the theories down on account of game mechanics and game limitations. So one of the theories I had was, was Edith possibly raped? That's one of the things I thought, because if you think about it, really the female has control over the lineage, the story, right? And so a female could potentially say, I want to end this, therefore I'm not going to have kids. If I don't have kids, it's ended, right? And because she was pregnant, but she knew of the legend, it was, okay, well, I must not have had control over this because I'm aware enough to know that I should end this, but I haven't ended it, and therefore maybe something. So I asked him about that, and he was like, "No, that's stupid." He didn't say stupid, but
No,
but
I
essentially
don't
he said
believe
that. Yeah. So he
Yeah.
basically shot that down, and so then I was like, well, and then I was thinking in terms of the next of kin is a male, and so if the next of kin is a male, which is Christopher, the guy who opens the story and then closes the story, because he's a male, was that a conscious decision to say that now there's the opportunity to stop the lineage? Basically, he now has the ability to not impregnate anybody. But he was like, no, we just made him a male because we wanted him to be different than Edith. We didn't want confusion. We gave him a cast and we gave him a Christopher so that people wouldn't think he was Edith. That's all it was. And I loved when he explained that to me. It was so incredible because I'm looking way too deep into this.
Mm-hmm.
They made decisions based off their technical limitations and based off of what players would intuit. They didn't make decisions all the time based on the story necessarily. And I was like, it just blew my mind, because I'm I feel like I should I'm trying to read into all of these things, and he's like, no, man, you're reading way too much into this. No,
Yeah.
we give him a cast to make him different than Edith. That's it. There's no deeper meaning. And I was like, that's really incredible and cool. So I don't know. I think there was some. So I think it was intentional that Christopher was the framing device. He was the intro. He was the outro, and him reading the journal was the story. So I think you are playing as Edith. It's just Christopher's the framing device, is what I think.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I think too. And about this thing about the sexes, you look at Odin, the reason he came to America in the first place was because he lost his wife and daughter.
Mm.
So he was the engine that brought him to the States.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And his wife and one of his kids. So because he came to America with, Edie and her husband.
So if he's like the quote unquote seed of the curse, if we want to call it the curse or the legend or whatever, like it's almost like it shines a light on him being super selfish, right? Like he's willing to procreate knowing that this is a possible, you're giving birth knowing that you're killing someone by giving birth to them, kind of thing, is the way I guess that kind of, I don't know.
Well, like you look at Odin, I don't think he necessarily looked at that as a curse. He like escaping a curse. I think that he was probably coming to America to change the winds, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But he brought his house with him.
Yeah.
Why would you do that?
That is a weird thing. You're right. That's like so weird that like
maybe the curse, if there is a curse, is this house that you're bringing.
House, yeah.
I don't know.
Huh.
I don't know. And he ended up dying, so it doesn't matter, right?
It's true. Yeah, that's a fair point though. Like, because I think at some point Edith does say like the house is kind of the curse. It's the house is the curse, like not the stories or anything. And but the actual like original house is still in the ocean. We didn't really talk on that much, but like the house that they have on land isn't actually the house. It was
right. And throughout the generations, you see this house out in the ocean with the little red light.
Yeah, you're constantly having to look at it. It's there.
Yeah.
It's always in your mind. It's always in your consciousness. And your consciousness is what's going to shape the kind of stories you tell. So if you're always seeing this flashing light, of course you're going to like create stories around it. Oh, that's cool. I like that.
Wow.
Like I said, this is like my top 3 favorite games of all time. Like I'm going to continually, if I was ever going to write like a boss fight book, it would be about what Remains of Edith Finch. Like I freaking love this game.
Man.
I should. Yeah. If you're listening, boss fight books, I have a lot of time.
About the books, like I didn't. I recognized a few of the books in the shelves, and I found that they repeated.
Yeah, they did a lot actually.
Okay.
I asked Ian Dallas about this because I actually on my website, calebjross.com. If anyone is still listening to this. I create a list of all of the books that appear in the game, and they repeat a lot. And I asked him about this because there's a particular book called Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, which is notoriously a very thick book. But there are several instances of this book being very thin on the shelves. And I asked him, I asked about this. I'm like, did that bother you? And he said, yeah, it did at first, but I gave up on that like long ago. Because he realized that from a development standpoint, it's very difficult to make accurate spine. Like it's so much more time effective to just randomly assign spine widths and titles just at random. Like it doesn't make sense to actually like try to create actual like time, and he's like, originally there was only like, a dozen or so different books. And he was like, I was lucky to get like a couple hundred books. Like so yeah, it was kind of like, I don't think they counted on people, nerds like me, like digging in and seeing like, you repeated this book 1,000 times. I'm
always looking at the bookshelves. And Alice in Wonderland, I've read that book. There was Into the Wild by John Krakauer. I've read that book. I really like that one. But, there were some that I think they were just taking the piss, to be honest. They were just making up titles as they went along. And
in my page that I created. So if you just search Google for like what Remains of Edith Finch books or something, you'll find it. But I included the author as well. And there's a lot of books that don't have authors. So I'm pretty sure they just made up the titles for a lot of, especially the cookbooks. The cookbooks were the ones that I found no authors for at all.
Right. Anyways. Yeah.
So I do want to, for the sake of time, I do want to kind of tie some things up here. Just wanted to kind of ask very quickly, and Ryan, I do want to come to you on this. Were there any favorite moments, maybe that aren't necessarily tied to any one story, but there's just things that you found that you were particularly fond of, or gave you some kind of a response? Ryan,
the pink bathroom.
Yes.
I have one of those.
With carpet
So,
and everything.
I threw away the carpet when I bought the house. It was
Carpet in a bathroom is the weirdest thing.
yeah, it was a little too old. It
Yeah.
needed to go. So yeah, I've shown off my pink bathroom on the last Cartridge Club charity streams. I made it an incentive if I could raise a certain amount of money during my stream, I would show off the pink bathroom. Musty, you have seen my pink bathroom.
Oh, I have, with the gold foil wallpaper and all that.
Awesome. I
It's
love it.
yeah,
It's
but
magnificent.
as I was playing the game and you walk in it, it was one of those moments I was like, "Hey, I have one of these." It was just.
And
a
then you
little,
questioned
yeah.
everything about your family and death, and yeah.
Yeah. And then I don't have a secret passage in my bathroom, but I do have a pink bathroom. So
Step
that
it
is
up,
one thing.
Ryan. Step it up.
So,
I think if I can throw one thing out there there was like a cool moment. Oh, the way that Odin's story is portrayed is
Mhm.
as if you were using an old Viewmaster.
Yeah.
I love that too. Oh,
And
yes.
and it was very much you had to use the right trigger as the pull down to advance it to the next in the circular slide.
Viewmaster, yeah, I love that.
Yeah, that was
So
a
good.
really cool inclusion. Now, funny enough, that story I missed Odin's story the first time through.
Really?
Oh,
Yeah, you can leave that room
Yeah,
without
can.
going through that story.
Mm.
And I honestly, I have to wonder if you can do that with there's some that you kind of have to move along.
I think you can, but I think that's a commentary on the power of narrative, right? Like if you don't willingly experience the narrative,
Mhm.
then you're going to miss out. And that's kind of almost the commentary of the game. Like, are you going to miss out on life if you don't attribute a story to that event in your life? Like, I think it's
Right.
I think it's awesome that you can actually play the game and miss some of the stories. Honestly, I wish they would have created a game where you could not experience any of the stories. Like, it's almost like a Far Cry 4 thing where it's like you could just wait 15 seconds and like not experience the game at all and still technically beat it. Like, that would be kind of cool
Well,
too. I think.
to throw another but another reference to another walking sim, Gone Home is that way.
Yeah.
You can finish
Yes.
that game within a minute.
Yep.
If you choose to. But yeah.
Yep.
Did either Caleb or Sarah, did either of you have any other moments that you wanted to mention before we get some community impressions here?
The only thing I'll mention is I don't know how many people, this is probably a deep cut, but I don't know how many people realize that Milton's story was the same story as the previous game that this company created called God, what was the name of the game?
Unfinished
The
Swan.
Unfinished Swan.
The Unfinished Swan. Thank you very much. The Unfinished Swan, which is a great game, by the way. Like, The Unfinished Swan is technically the first game by Giant Sparrow Studios. And it's a very different game, but it's still a very cool looking game. Like, it's a cool, just visually cool game. And so I would highly recommend everyone play that. A couple hours as well. Pretty close to a walking simulator. I mean, there are technically loose conditions, so it's not actually a walking simulator, but very good. But yeah, the king in that game, which is sort of your guiding legend orator, is Milton, and the kid in that game, the protagonist that you play as Monroe, which I think is a character that's mentioned a couple of times in What Remains of Edith Finch, but it's not like a main character. But yeah, you get to play as that, and so you get a little bit more insight into one of the penultimate stories in the What Remains of Edith Finch, where you are the guy who falls into the painting. Essentially, it's basically the game of the guy who falls into the painting. So I would highly recommend everyone play that. It's very good, very interesting design wise, not nearly as deep as What Remains of Edith Finch from a story perspective, but still very cool and part of the lore. It's official canon, so definitely take a look.
What I would say is Edie in general. I loved going through her room and finding all the elements that I'm into. Like, there's wool, so she knits, she crochets, she does cross stitching, she sews, she paints, all the things that I'm into. I'm pretty crafty, but I also enjoyed experiencing Edie herself when she was actually explaining how there was such a low tide that she was able to access the house,
Yeah.
the original house, for one last time. And I don't know how you can interpret it, but you know, she finally reaches the house and a light goes on.
Mm-hmm.
And just then, Dawn says, "What are you doing?" to Edith. And of course, she's reading the book, and that's where all this falls apart. I just thought that was quite interesting. You know, she gets lost out there in the and it smells, and I got to interact with my things again. It was like I was coming home, and you know, like I thought that was very interesting. You know,
I want their next game to be an Edie game. Like, I want the entire game to be Edie. I want to understand what caused Edie to want to imbue every event with story. Like, why was that so important to her? That's what I want. I want the next game to be that.
yeah, if there's a continuation.
There better be, god damn it.
Yeah, there's not much out there right now of what they're working on next, but I think we're all fairly excited for it whenever word gets out. And there are lots of people who are excited about this game this month. We had a fair number of community members who decided to join in. So I want to give special shout out to those who played along. We had Kevin, Buried on Mars. We had Catherine and Miles from Flock of Nerds. Pam from Cannot Be Tamed. Dean, as mentioned before, Round 2 Gaming. Travis and Jake, both from Polykill Podcast. And Josh were the ones who vocalized them playing along in either Twitter or on the forums over at cartridgeclub.org. But we did ask for some community impressions. And so, Ryan, I want to throw to you to give us the responses that we got from the community on Twitter when we asked for some thoughts on the game.
Sure. So starting us off, we have Travis from Polykill, and he writes, "Delightfully tragic." Following that up,
Dumb comment by Trav.
Well, following that up, his co-host from the Polykill podcast, we have Jake, and he writes, the best first-person experience I've played. It's an amazing soundtrack, intriguing but an accessible story, lovely art."
You're stupid, Jake. All right, keep going.
We also have your co-host, Caleb, VG Collectaholic here.
What a dick.
He writes questionable I can't say this word.
Architectural stability.
Thank you.
Grammatical stability, questionable grammatical stability. Yeah, he's a lawyer, so what the fuck does he know about architecture?
Make your words easier. We have Cartridge Bros. This is Sean from the Cartridge Brothers. He writes, "I really enjoyed this experience. I'm glad you guys gave me the push to play it, and it's on Game Pass. Gave me the means."
Yeah, well, I would say that did the game appreciate the experience as well? Because I guess no. So
we'll follow that up with Josh from Frantic Society. He writes, "Heartbreaking, beautiful, and thought-provoking."
You only have the right to comment on Kingdom Hearts games. Shut up, Josh.
And then we have Kovic, and he writes, "It might be fairly short, but it's a game that keeps you intrigued throughout and makes you want to finish in one sitting. The bathtub sequence won't be forgotten anytime soon." He goes, "I played this game over a year ago, but I still vividly remember it." That says a lot.
All of those comments describe the porno I've created, which you can find at, I don't know.
Nope. We're gonna stop there.
And we have one comment from the CC forums here, and it's from Pam. And she writes, "Man, what a good game. I love so much of what they do here. The way they present the words on the screen in the different ways that they fall, dispense, or flung away when you're done with them. How different each little story vignette plays, and how such different lengths. The ultimate satisfaction of finding and using secret passages, and the way that shark rolls down a cliff. This time when playing, I immediately looked down to see my character's model. The first time around, her being pregnant was a surprise to me, but it's definitely visible right from the start." So those are people.
I can't even make a crude joke about Pam's comments because she will forever be the person who introduced me to the Wolfenstein series. which I thought was just a stupid first-person shooter game, and she was like, "No, it's a good story." And I'm like, "All right, fine." And sure enough, it was a goddamn perfect story game, and I'm like, "All right, everything Pam says, I take as gospel." So,
well, we appreciate everyone who took the time to play along with Prime
especially
this
Pam.
month. Especially Pam. And Pam, congratulations on your new subscriber milestones. That's something that we can all aspire for. It's awesome. Anyways, yeah, like I was saying, we appreciate everyone taking the time to play along with us and to interact with us on Twitter and in the forums. And we would encourage you to do that again in the upcoming months. But want to kind of give us a chance to tie a little bow on this. And so I want to give everyone maybe a couple sentences to wrap up your thoughts on the game. I want to start with Caleb.
One of the best games I've ever played, but admittedly, because I am a lover of narrative, a lover of literature, and that probably colors that quite a bit. But I love it. Are we talking about where people can follow us now, or is that
Not yet?
Not yet. All right, I love it.
Sarah,
I would definitely recommend this. There's a lot going for it, and I think a lot that would appeal to many different people.
Okay, I will go with mine, and I'll just say there's a lot of things that you could do that take 2 hours that pale in comparison to what you get out of this game. Even after repeated playthroughs, it is way up there for just excellence in storytelling, and I could not encourage you to play it more highly.
And I'll say that it's always seems to be on sale, so pick it up. It's if you want a nice relaxing game that like you can knock out and not, that's the thing about it. It doesn't overstay its welcome. It's just a nice relaxing game. You can just sit back and witness a whole bunch of people die. But yeah, I do recommend it. It's a good time, and it's not too expensive, and it's on Game Pass. So if you are a Game Pass subscriber, you can knock it out.
Even if you're not, it's well worth the purchase. I would say.
Yeah, I got mine free through Epic Games.
And with that being said, that's the show, everyone. But I want to thank our wonderful guests for coming on and talking about this game. So Caleb, where can we find you online? Give us some plugs here.
Oh, I love plugs. So Caleb J. Ross, the letter J, all one word, Caleb J. Ross, at Twitter, but I'm most active probably on YouTube, same username, Caleb J. Ross.
Thanks for being here.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for having me. I love it. I love talking about this goddamn game.
Yeah, and I can't wait. I can't wait till you get this one on your top 100 games of all time there, Caleb.
Yes, I am doing a top 100 games of all time list. Every video is about 5 new games. So I don't know, subscribe, and then in 3 months, you'll hear about this game.
all narrated by Miles, right?
That's right. Oh, he has the best number transitions of any person in the world. I will go to the grave saying that. So there you go.
Well, thanks for being here. And Sarah, where can we find you online? Give us some plugs.
So I have a blog called Caught Me Gaming. It's caughtmegaming.wordpress.com. And I'm also on Twitter at Sarca_sim, SARCA_SIM. And I'm on there too. So thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Awesome.
Had a good time.
You're a terrific guest.
Oh, thank you very much.
And for myself, you can find me on Twitter at It's Rocket Sauce. I have an Instagram, and I post things I find interesting or pickups I get. And so you can find me on there as well. And Musty, where can we find you?
Yep. So on my social medias, I am most active on Twitter. So you can find me at MustyHobbit. I do have a YouTube channel that is Second Breakfast. And I'm going to be picking up Twitch and trying to lean into that a little bit harder in the coming weeks and months. And so you can find me there at MustyHobbit as well. But again, as a reminder to everyone, or if maybe you stumbled upon the show because of your love of What Remains of Edith Finch, Ryan and I do select a new game for our community to play along with Prime every month. And so for April, we will be playing the black sheep of the Zelda franchise, the other gold card on the NES, and that is Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. And if you enjoyed this show, we do have a second show on this very feed that's exclusively focused on a handheld game each month. So if that sounds like that's up your alley, Curtis, who is the host, has selected Thor, God of Thunder on the Nintendo DS as the CC portable game for April. For both shows, as well as other podcast videos and blogs, hop over to cartridgeclub.org and peruse the forums there, or join our Discord server to engage with our growing community. Both CC Prime and CC Portable can be found on iTunes, Podbean, and now Spotify. And we'd love a review of the show to help get the word out if you would be so kind. Finally, to those of you who are interested in supporting the club beyond a review on the podcast app of your choice, I'd like to reiterate that the club itself is entirely funded by pledges made from members of our community. We're extremely grateful to those supporters. So if you're interested in becoming one of them, please check out our offerings at patreon.com/Cartridge Club. We look forward to hearing from you next month. CC Unite.
Mm-hmm.